My speech today will be on strengthening global resilience in an era of geoeconomic uncertainty, the role of rules-based cooperation and inclusive growth. To call this an era of geoeconomic uncertainty feels like a polite understatement. The global order created in the wake of World War II to foster stability, predictability, peace, and prosperity is experiencing the most severe disruptions of its 80-year existence. So much that shaped the world we know is being called into question, from the role of the United Nations and other multilateral organizations like the World Bank, the IMF, and the WTO, my organization, to even the very notion of a system based on rules rather than naked power. In a famous speech earlier this year in Davos by McCartney, and I was sitting right under his nose in Davos when he gave this speech, the Canadian Prime Minister, he declared the global order to be in the midst of and I quote, a rupture, not a transition. He's right that major structural shifts are shaking both domestic politics and the wider world. But I differ slightly in interpretation, because I do not believe that these shifts are leading to a less interdependent world. What we are seeing is not the end of globalization, but its transformation from cooperative to competitive interdependence. States compete vigorously, but within a global economic system they cannot afford to abandon. They seek to outpace rivals, but without sacrificing the benefits of economic integration. The hope that global economic integration will produce geopolitical harmony may have faded, at least for now. But this emerging era of competitive interdependence only makes the case for a rules-based system stronger, not weaker. In the first segment of my remarks today, I will look at how geopolitical and other shifts are contributing to rising uncertainty. I'll then focus on why geopolitical rivalry and uncertainty has so far not translated into declining global trade and major fragmentation, despite numerous predictions to the contrary. Finally, I will look at the genuinely exciting opportunities that exist even amid today's uncertainties for countries to use global trade to drive growth, job creation, development, and economic resilience. And this is a conversation the governor and I were having before coming into this room, and I think we'll have during our chat together. Now, starting with the structural sources of today's uncertainty, let's look at 5. First, the balance of global economic power has changed dramatically within the space of a generation. In 1995, advanced economies accounted for about 60% of global economic output in purchasing power parity terms, and developing countries only 40%. Now, these shares have flipped, thanks to 3 decades of faster growth in the developing world, growth that open global trade helped to make possible. Although not all regions have been part of this rebalancing, Africa's share of global GDP remains stubbornly low. This shift has already sufficed to spawn anxiety and even resentment within many rich countries, stoking geopolitical tensions and affecting attitudes to trade and aid. Second, economic inequality within many countries has shifted upwards, with those at the upper end of the scale getting an increasing share of national income and wealth. Widespread perceptions that the rich are getting richer while others lag behind are fueling angry politics and unstable policy. According to the report to the G20 by a committee of independent experts on global inequality, led by Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz, over 2/3 of the global population live in countries where the top 1% have increased their share of income since 2000. With respect to wealth, the dynamics are even more pronounced. The top 1% increased their share in countries home to nearly 3/4 of the global population. Third, a series of technological shifts from computers and the internet to AI, which you heard about this morning, I think from Indemit Gill, have transformed the ways we communicate, produce, and trade. But some workers have been disempowered and even thrown out of jobs by automation, particularly within advanced economies. Fears of large-scale AI-induced job losses are intensifying, and history reminds us that waves of new technologies are often accompanied by economic anxiety and social unrest, even when sometimes they are not threatened. Fourth, our changing climate is imposing unequal burdens across countries and within them. Europe's struggles with heat waves this summer are only part of the story. The World Meteorological Organization estimates that African countries on average are losing 2 to 5% of GDP annually due to climate change, with many diverting as much as 9% of their budgets to responding to the consequences of extreme weather. And fifth, a demographic shift, with aging populations and falling birth rates across much of the developed world and some emerging markets. Sharpened anxieties around immigration and labor market shortages. Meanwhile, Africa is emerging as the world's future workforce and market. If truth be told, national governments and international institutions have struggled to respond to these shifts. These struggles have created fertile ground for anti-system narratives, as many people in rich and poor countries feel that the established order is not helping them cope with the changes reshaping their lives. Trade in particular has been blamed for job losses, for inequality, for empowering geopolitical rivals, and more. To be fair, much of what is currently being laid at the door of trade and the trading system, in fact, owes more to other forces. More jobs were lost to automation than to import competition. To help people and places adapt, governments need to put in place strong, active labor market policies and social safety nets. Not all of them could do this in a good way. Inequality has more to do with domestic tax and labor policies, which is why countries similarly exposed to trade have such different outcomes. Large trade imbalances are strongly correlated with protectionist pressures, but they are primarily driven by macroeconomic factors like domestic savings and investment rates and capital flows, not by trade policies. Both the World Bank and IMF research, as well as WTO, have been clear about this. To deal with today's imbalances, China needs to consume more domestically and rely less on export-led growth, since it is difficult for the rest of the world to absorb its large export surpluses, whilst the US has to save more and get its fiscal house in order. But this is not to say that there are no real problems in the way both global trade and the World Trade Organization are operating, and that is part of what has brought us to the current juncture. Unless we also acknowledge the problems with global trade rules and policies, we shall be doing a disservice to everyone who is dissatisfied with the present global economic conditions. In recent years, it has become clear that the world economy is marked by some troubling over-dependencies. That's my word. For example, over-dependence on China for critical minerals, batteries, and some key supplies, on Chinese Taipei, that's what we call Taiwan at the World Bank, for cutting-edge semiconductors, and on the US for digital services as well as final market demand. In a global trading system designed to foster interdependence, the weaponization of some of these over-dependencies is fueling resentment, anxiety, and political tension. Within the WTO, although members rich and poor have for years raised legitimate concerns about a wide range of issues, ranging from inadequate policy transparency to unfair trade practices, level playing field issues, and policy space to support industrialization, members have collectively failed to respond by amending and updating the WTO rulebook. Although this has finally started to change and reform discussions are underway at the WTO, the conversations we needed didn't happen for far too long. And the result is that trade rules have not kept up with the times. The smart response to problems of overdependence and overconcentration is to enhance resilience by diversifying and deconcentrating trade and investment relationships to bring in currently marginalized countries and communities. Such re-globalization as we call it at the WTO, would help shift from overdependence to a healthier interdependence that is less vulnerable to shocks and bilateral pressure. Some of this diversification is beginning to happen as many countries strike new bilateral and regional trade deals. I'll come back to this point later. But unfortunately, we are still getting a large increase in trade policy uncertainty as important trading partners of blocs continue the shifts of trade policies and measures. Businesses that do not know what trade barriers they'll face tomorrow will think twice, probably more than twice, before investing, especially in new locations. This illustrates the danger of negative feedback loops of geoeconomic uncertainty, in which responses to the structural causes of uncertainty end up making uncertainty worse instead of better. Having spent the past several minutes talking about challenges, structural shifts, fragmentation, geopolitical tensions, and so forth, let me switch to the good news. Everything I said thus far is accurate, and yet things have not fallen apart. Far from it. The value of global goods and services trade was at a record $34.65 trillion in 2025, up 7% on the previous year. In volume terms, world merchandise trade grew by 4.6% as surging demand for AI-related goods offset weaknesses linked to tariff increases. And trade policy uncertainty. Services trade grew by 5.3%, again in volume terms, and within that, trade in digitally delivered services grew even faster, at almost 6%. Most countries continue to trade on rules-based WTO terms. Around 72% of global goods trade continues to flow on core WTO most favored nation tariff terms. And people are often surprised when I mention this number. I was telling the governor that when I said 72% of world trade still goes on WTO terms, everybody started quarreling with it. Some people said, no, the US has destroyed the place with these measures. Everybody was, they wanted it to look really bad. So I said, okay, to my staff, publish the methodology, which they did. And I said, anyone who has a better methodological approach to calculating the trade that goes on WTO MFN terms, they can bring it and we'll change. And we put it out there and no one has come forward. So I'm very confident in telling you, we didn't change the way we calculate. 72% of the world's trade still goes on WTO terms. And an additional 16% flows on terms within the wider WTO framework, mostly tariff preferences arising from bilateral and regional trade agreements that are built on WTO foundations. Some of this is reflected in the trade diversification I mentioned earlier. That is why we are supportive of bilateral and regional trade agreements that seek to build trade channels, because a large number of them are built on the bedrock, on the foundation of WTO rules. We should also remember that the WTO's role goes well beyond tariffs. Our rules for health and safety standards, technical regulations, customs valuation, and intellectual property function as the plumbing of global trade. And I always joke everywhere that, like plumbing, you don't really remember the plumbing in your house. You don't think about it until a pipe breaks and floods your sitting room or wherever, the house, isn't it? You take it for granted. People take the WTO for granted because we are the plumbing of trade. And they don't think about it until something goes wrong. And we're very happy to be the plumbing. Anchored by this stable and broadly open core, global trade has bounced back from a series of shocks. COVID-19 and related supply disruptions, the war in Ukraine, which affected energy and food markets, US tariffs and related measures, and problems in key transport corridors like the Suez and Panama canals. Global goods trade volumes in 2025 were over 12% higher than in 2019, the year before the pandemic, while services trade volumes were 31% higher. Countries are responding to the Strait of Hormuz crisis with more trade facilitating than trade restrictive measures. lifting trade restrictions, facilitating trade in oil and gas products, finding alternative routes to get oil and fertilizer out of the region. While these measures have not been enough to compensate for the closure of the strait, which has hit the world, and especially vulnerable African countries with higher energy, fertilizer, and food prices, they have helped build resilience and prevented a situation that could have been considerably worse for the global economy. On the whole, while heightened strategic competition is affecting some sensitive products and bilateral relationships, the revealed preference of most countries seems to be for continued interdependence, albeit within concentric circles of relatively closer or looser integration. The Global South offers a case in point. The share of South-South trade in the global total has increased from under 1/10 in 1995 to about a quarter today, and they're keeping their trade diplomats busy. Of the 384 existing regional trade agreements that have been formally notified to the WTO, 49% are among developing countries. Among the 80-odd additional agreements that have not been notified, the South-South share appears to be even higher. And 22 economies still outside the 166-strong WTO are working hard to accede to it. There are good reasons for this, for all of this. Open and predictable trade does not just enable export-led growth and the productivity gains that come with increased specialization and scale. Open and predictable trade can be a powerful force for macroeconomic stability, and I think the central bank is interested in that. Research by the IMF's newly appointed chief economist, LSE Professor Silvana Tenrero, has demonstrated that trade serves as a cushion against domestic economic shocks and helps reduce GDP volatility by allowing countries to diversify sources of demand and supply. A drop in domestic demand can be cushioned if exporters can sell abroad. Domestic supply shocks similarly can be better managed if firms can source from foreign suppliers. Exposure to more markets, not fewer, enhances the stabilizing effects of trade. In sum, while integration and win-win interdependence entail vulnerabilities, fragmenting trade or trying to go it alone would likely be even worse. This brings me to the final segment of my speech. Although as we have seen, global trade and the trading system are resilient, rebounding from successive crises, they are not robust. And with the ongoing erosion of long-standing trade rules and norms, we have to wonder about the limits of this resilience next time we're hit with a major shock. One way to enhance the system's robustness and future resilience is strengthening and updating the global trade rulebook. That is why the renewed efforts on WTO reform now underway in Geneva, following our 14th Ministerial Conference in Cameroon, are so important. Under the leadership of our General Council Chair, Ambassador Claire Kelly of New Zealand, negotiators are engaged in intensive work on the full spectrum of reform issues, including relooking at foundational principles such as MFM, Most Favored Nation, and transparency to ensure they can still anchor the trading system of the future. Looking at our concerns with the decision-making system, not to do away with consensus, which is the way we make decisions, but to see how it can be made more agile and flexible so that consensus as unanimity does not get in the way of making decisions. Looking at the use of subsidies and other level playing field concerns and at how WTO can better support development to integrate developing countries better into the trading system. In addition, as the world increasingly digitizes and moves rapidly on AI, members will look at gaps in our rulebook to provide a shared base for this rapid transformation. The goal is to lay the groundwork for outcomes between now and our next 15th Ministerial Conference in 2028. As I see it, the reform process offers a path for members to strengthen what is still working well at the WTO, because a lot is. But even more importantly, it's an opportunity to repair what is not working well, and better still, to begin to fill gaps in global trade rulebook that will help countries take advantage of emerging commercial opportunities in areas like services, digital trade, and green trade. A silver lining of the present disruptions in global trade is that they have convinced all members that far-reaching institutional reform is necessary. The challenge now is to get there. None of that will be easy. With little trust among my members, it will be more like pushing a boulder uphill. But push we must. For that, we still need consistent political attention and a willingness to search for solutions. You all can help by advocating for WTO reform with your respective organizations and capitals. A second way to make the trading system more robust and resilient is by ensuring more countries and regions become substantial sources of global supply and demand. This is linked to the reglobalization I mentioned earlier. With more companies and countries looking to supply diversification, whether to reduce exposure to geopolitical or other risks, places outside established production networks, especially places in Africa, Latin America, and Central Asia, have an opportunity to attract value chain investment. One high potential sector is critical minerals, where the green transition is driving demand for lithium, bauxite, cobalt, and other elements necessary to manufacture EV batteries and other low carbon goods. Africa holds an estimated 30% of the world's known mineral reserves, and estimates for Latin America are similar. For Africa in particular, instead of the extract and export model that has been the source of so much volatility, economic underperformance, and let me be blunt, corruption, conflict, and banditry, the goal should be higher value, higher productivity growth, driven by the development of sub-regional value chains and integration into potential supply networks. Quite frankly, the time to seize this opportunity is now. As geopolitics exerts some demand pressure for critical mineral supply chain diversification. If we miss this opportunity, I'm afraid we would have missed a lot. Fortunately, Africa's leaders seem to be moving in the right direction, with Morocco using its phosphate resources to produce electric vehicle components for international markets, particularly Chinese automakers. In Zambia, DRC, Mozambique, and Angola, and here also in Nigeria, moves are afoot to see how to add value to critical minerals. But these efforts need more systematization and harmonization, including a look at sub-regional approaches so that countries are not picked off one by one in suboptimal bilateral agreements. The continent can seize green comparative advantages by harnessing abundant renewable energy potential to power minerals processing. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude by noting that these two paths to global trade resilience, reforming the multilateral trading system and broadening the global economic base, are deeply complementary. To attract the kind of investments we've been talking about, developing countries will need to improve their business climate, upgrade hard and soft infrastructure, and provide a stable macroeconomic environment. In this regard, I want to commend the Central Bank Governor of Nigeria, Governor Cardoso, on the work that he and his team have done on currency and monetary policy stabilization. Nigeria needs to continue. Yes, you can clap for him. Nigeria needs to continue the work on overall macroeconomic reforms with a careful approach to fiscal issues, contracting of debt, and debt management. Above all, Nigeria needs to focus on creating jobs and economic opportunities for a young and hungry population. Nigerians have to feel the dividends of reform in the real economy. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, instead of negative feedback loops of uncertainty, fragmentation, and slower growth, we have an opportunity to build positive feedback loops of reformed rules, greater certainty, and improved economic prospects for people and businesses everywhere. As we work together to find bridges across the many fault lines dividing our world, let us draw inspiration from Dr. Martin Luther King's reminder that, and I quote, all mankind are tied together. All mankind, is tied together. All life is interrelated, and we are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. Whatever affects one directly affects all of us indirectly. Thank you for listening.
first female Director General of the World Organization, the first African of the World Director General of the World Trade Organization, and of course, the great representation of the Nigeria Can movement on the global stage. Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the Chief Executive of the Emerging Markets Forum, Mr. Harinder Kohli, and I really want to thank you very much indeed, Mr. Kohli, for giving us the opportunity to host you here in Nigeria. And I want to say this with all sense of seriousness, because I do know that sometimes there's a tendency for international participants and international community to shy away from doing things in Nigeria. You didn't. In fact, not just did you not, but honestly, the very comforting words and the words of praise that you've given to Nigeria since you came here yesterday have been really, really commendable, and I thank you very much indeed for this. Let me highlight, however, three major shifts that I expect will shape Africa's opportunities in this changing global environment. First, trade is fragmenting. Geo-economic considerations are causing countries to look inward and to reorganize trade and critical supply chains around trusted partners and neighboring markets through nearshoring and friendshoring. For Africa, this change is both a warning and an opportunity. With intra-African trade still accounting for only about 16% of our total trade, we must build stronger regional value chains, produce more of what we consume, and trade more with one another. The African Continental Free Trade Area provides the platform and opportunity to turn this global shift to an African advantage. But we must go beyond the agreements and remove the practical barriers to trade by improving transport networks, harmonizing customs standards, and making cross-border payments faster and more affordable. Second, capital has become selective and impatient. The era of abundant liquidity, chasing returns regardless of risk, is over. Investors now have more choices and less tolerance for uncertainty. Capital increasingly flows to economies that offer credibility, transparency, policy consistency, and strong institutions. For Africa, this means that our development ambitions cannot depend solely on attracting foreign capital. We must mobilize more of our own resources, including pension and insurance funds, domestic savings, and diaspora capital, and channel them towards productive domestic investment. It also means that there's a premium on the quality of Africa's institutions. Investors must be able to trust our policies, understand our rules, and plan beyond the next political or economic cycle. So credibility is not only a central bank concern, it is a national economic asset. Third, artificial intelligence is reshaping economic activity. It is changing how goods are produced, how services are delivered, and the skills required to compete. It is disrupting established industries while creating entirely new business models, services, and forms of work. And of course, thank you very much to Mr. Gill in the midst for delivering such a lovely presentation earlier this morning on this particular topic. Africa must move beyond being consumers of technology. We must become creators, developing African solutions to African challenges, and building businesses capable of taking those solutions to the world. To achieve this, Africa must invest in the foundations of an AI-enabled economy, including reliable electricity, affordable connectivity, digital infrastructure, and above all, a generation of AI-savvy young Africans ready to build solutions for the continent and to compete globally. Nigeria's recent experience demonstrates how an emerging market economy can respond to these shifts. Over the past 3 years, we have made difficult but necessary policy decisions to restore stability, rebuild confidence, and strengthen the economy's capacity to withstand shocks. At the Central Bank of Nigeria, we returned firmly to our core mandate. We unified the exchange rate, restored price discovery, ended monetary financing of fiscal deficits, and rebuilt the foreign exchange market around transparency and settlement integrity. We tightened monetary policy when necessary and communicated our decisions clearly, including when the message was difficult. Today, the results of those sacrifices are evident. Inflation has moderated from high levels despite the energy shock. External buffers have strengthened, and the financial system is safer and better capitalized to support the economy. We have learned one lesson. Credibility is built intentionally, one right decision after another, and strengthened through consistent action. That same lesson holds at the continental level. If Africa is to benefit from these global shifts, rather than become a victim of them, we must convert our potential into tangible gains. That transformation will rest on 4 foundations. 1, the first is macroeconomic stability, no surprises. No nation has industrialized under persistently high inflation and an unstable exchange rate. Stability gives households and businesses the confidence to consume and invest, and gives investors the certainty to commit capital for the long term. Second is continental scale. The African Continental Free Trade Area gives Africa a solid platform, but we must build the market. Third is patient capital that creates productive capacity. We must mobilize Africa's pensions, insurance assets, domestic savings, and diaspora wealth. We must also seek foreign investment that creates jobs, transfers technology, develops local suppliers, and strengthens African businesses, not investment that simply extracts value and leaves. The fourth and most important is our people. We must prepare young Africans for an AI-enabled economy and unlock the full economic participation of women, because Africa cannot fly with one wing. Our goal must be an Africa in which young entrepreneurs can build, scale, and compete without having to leave the continent to realize their potential elsewhere. The Jackpot syndrome. Let me close with a simple thought. The anxiety surrounding the changing global economic order is real, and we've heard it. But disruption also creates opportunity. We've heard that also. As established rules are rewritten, emerging markets have an opportunity to move from being rule takers to becoming rule setters. Africa now has an opportunity to help shape the emerging order, but that opportunity will not be realized by potential alone. It will require strategic collaboration, credible institutions, and the courage to act together. There is much more to discuss, and I am confident that my conversation with our global ambassador, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, will take us deeper into important dimensions of these questions that I have briefly touched on. The world is changing. Let us seize this moment for Africa. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Governor. Please, another round of applause.